I'm with Jessica Mandell from Hamouk Center for the Defense of the Individual here in Jerusalem. Now, Jessica, what is Hamouk?
Hamouk is a legal aid and human rights organization assisting Palestinians in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip.
And when was this organization started?
Hamouk was founded in 1989. So for over 30 years, we've been here in this spot, serving as a walk-in clinic for Palestinians who have troubles, victims of human rights violations, and also working more strategically to challenge Israeli policies that violate human rights.
And what does Hamouk mean?
Hamouk means hotline.
Now, in 2021, over 5,000 Palestinians turned to you for assistance. Can you tell us a bit about some of their stories?
Yes. The reasons people come to Hamouk for assistance really illustrate the scope of Israeli control over daily lives of Palestinians. So, when a Palestinian is arrested by Israeli forces, there's no way to find out where your family member is being held. And people turn to us, the day after their son or husband or other family member was arrested just to find out where they're located. And any Palestinian who needs to travel between the West Bank and Gaza, to travel abroad, to get access even inside the West Bank, to get access to their lands on the other side of the separation barrier, all of these people are going to need permits from the Israeli military. And navigating that permit bureaucracy can be very difficult, unclear, and people turn to Hamouk either because they can't get any response at all from the military or because their requests have been denied, and then we challenge those denials.
Now, we put some figures together from 2021. So you had 391 families in East Jerusalem who are seeking to realize their residency rights. So you live in Jerusalem and you're Palestinian. What is the difference between being a Jew living in Jerusalem and a Palestinian?
So East Jerusalem was annexed in 1967, but the people living there, Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, are residents of the State of Israel rather than citizens. And that is a more vulnerable status than citizenship. It's called permanent residency, but in fact that status can be taken from you. But then you also have a whole group of West Bank Palestinians living in East Jerusalem who are married to East Jerusalemites. And for the past 18 years, we've had a law in Israel banning family unification between West Bank Palestinians and East Jerusalem Palestinians. So, you could just marry somebody who lives down the street from you, but because they have a different ID card, you're a West Bank ID and they have an East Jerusalem ID, in order to live together in your home, you would need special permits from the Israeli military. Now, this is a law that expired last summer, and we're right now in a fight in the Knesset as, the right-wing elements within the government and the Knesset are trying to re-legislate this ban on family unification. But what that means is you have 10,000 people living in their homes in East Jerusalem who don't have a legal status to be living there.
Do people in East Jerusalem, do they have Israeli passports or do they have a Palestinian passport?
So there are citizens of Israel, whether they are Jewish or Arab Palestinian, have Israeli passports. Residents of Israel, and that's most of the East Jerusalem population, don't have Israeli passports, so they're traveling just on a travel document. Some of them have Jordanian passports, or they're traveling on a laissez-passer, an Israeli-issued travel document. You see now the problem on the border between Ukraine and Poland. Israeli citizens can enter Poland with no visa. But East Jerusalemites, and you have, say, medical students now studying in Ukraine, trying to escape the fighting, they get to the Polish border, they would need a visa because they're traveling just on a travel document, which obviously grants them far fewer privileges in terms of free movement.
But you could have them from the same city and both of them are treated differently.
Yes, because you have citizens and residents. I mean, even, in the same family, but definitely in the same neighborhood, you can have citizens of Israel who are traveling with Israeli passports and residents of Israel who do not.
Are there any other restrictions that Palestinians face here in East Jerusalem?
Yes. Well, let's take a few steps back. When Israel occupied East Jerusalem, the official policy, the explicit policy, was to maintain what they call the demographic balance in Jerusalem, meaning the relationship between the number of Jews living in the city and the number of Palestinians. So demographic balance sounds quite harmonious, but in fact what they mean is artificial measures to be increasing the Jewish population and measures to be restricting growth of the Palestinian population. The two main ways that Israel is restricting growth of the Palestinian population, one concerns residency rights, as I said, the prevention of family unification, the fact that they are residents rather than citizens of Israel, and the other means that Israel is using quite aggressively to restrict the growth of the Palestinian population relates to urban development, the planning of communities, building permits, who gets building permits, demolition of homes in Palestinian neighborhoods that were built without permits, although in some cases it's impossible to get permits.
Now, they have Palestinians in the West Bank, but there's also Palestinians in Gaza. Is it difficult for Palestinians in Gaza to see Palestinians in the West Bank?
Yes, Israel for the past 15 years has maintained a very tight closure on the Gaza Strip. Israel has defined Gaza as a hostile entity, and then both the movement of people in and out, as well as imports and exports of everything, is very tightly controlled and restricted. So you have families, people living in Israel, very near, physically near Gaza, or people living in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, families that are separated across all of these divides. And then there are very, very limited reasons that Israel will allow anyone to enter Gaza. Basically, it's only in cases, what they call exceptional humanitarian cases. So it could be a wedding of a very close family member, or a very severe illness, or the death, a funeral of a family member. Those are the only reasons that people could enter Gaza. I mean, you can't just decide you want to go for lunch at grandma's house. It has to be, almost just to see them on their deathbed, maybe the only time that you could actually visit your family in Gaza.
I know that Christians, during times like Christmas and Easter, they get permission from Gaza to come into the West Bank. Can they stay in the West Bank, or do they have to go back? Can they just decide, I don't want to go back to Gaza, I want to live in the West Bank? Can they do that?
So part of Israel's policies around restricting all the different Palestinian populations is preventing any movement from Gaza to the West Bank. Israel does not want people from Gaza living in the West Bank, although theoretically these are two halves of the Palestinian territory. Again, theoretically, the Palestinian Authority controls the population registry. It should be very straightforward to change your address. I live in Jerusalem, in Israel. If I move to Tel Aviv, it's just a, administrative procedure to change my address from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. It should be the same to move from Gaza to Bethlehem. But in fact, Israel prevents any changes of address between Gaza and the West Bank. A Gazan who comes to the West Bank, say to visit family or for medical care or for a religious holiday, and then stays in the West Bank, those people are considered illegal aliens. So a Palestinian from Gaza living in the West Bank is an illegal alien in their home because Israel does not agree to change the address in the population registry.
Now, Israel built a wall, and some of it may be built on farmers' land. So a farmer may have land or olive trees on both sides of the wall. How difficult is it for that farmer to visit his land on the Israeli side of the wall?
Yes, you have a very complicated permit bureaucracy to reach lands in what Israel calls the seam zone. These are the lands on the other side of the wall, the separation barrier. It's inside the West Bank, and it could be just walking distance from your house, but now there's this, barbed wire and fences and walls separating you from your land. You have to file a request for a permit. It's, again, very hard to navigate. Even you don't get an answer to your request, you have to ask again. They come back and ask for more documents. Recently, we have a lot of people who come to us. They say, well, your land is too small. If you have what they call a tiny plot, then they say, no, it's not worth cultivating that land, and then they won't give you a permit. So this is absolutely infuriating. You're talking about lands in the West Bank that people own, and Israel is deciding whether or not it's worth it for you to get a permit to reach your own land.
So you could have a farmer, and if it's not a wall and it's just fence, he can see his trees on the other side. Does he have to apply for a permit every single time to go and visit his land?
So people should be getting a 2-year permit. The people who succeed to get a farmer permit, that will be for 2 years. And then they can cross to their lands, but it's not free passage anytime they want. They have to cross through gates that are open at very specific times. So let's say one community that we're working closely with, Kafin in the northern West Bank, the gate from their home to get to their land, it's only open 3 days a week. It's open 3 times a day. So it could be from 6:30 to 7 in the morning, and again from noon to 12:30, and again from 4 to 4:30, 3 days a week. So then if you're a farmer, suddenly your whole life has to be structured around the opening times that the Israeli military has decided to let you get back and forth to your farmlands.
Fascinating. There must be a lot of bureaucracy involved in dealing with all of these different cases.
Yes. I mean, in fact, I say often that many people understand the conflict or the occupation to be very dramatic events that are, sometimes front page news all over the world. But in fact, for most Palestinians, the experience of occupation is a permit bureaucracy, and a very, hostile and difficult permit bureaucracy, that you need a permit sometimes to live in your own home. You need a permit to travel even very close by. You might need a permit. You need a permit to build a house if you're living in certain areas of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And all of these permit systems are not intended to be helpful for Palestinians, but in fact make their lives very difficult.
Why do you do what you do?
Well, for me, human rights are universal. Every person has the same basic rights. I'm a citizen of Israel, and it's important to me that my country live up to those ethical and legal standards.
And what's your hope for the future for Israel and for the Palestinians?
Well, we know that you can't have a situation where everybody enjoys their human rights in a situation of military occupation. I mean, that's true also for Israelis. It's in Israel's best interests that our neighbors are safe and secure and prosperous. And obviously, occupation does not enable that. And certainly for Palestinians to be free. So meanwhile, we are assisting wherever we can. We are challenging the Israeli government and the Israeli military to respect human rights, even in this situation of occupation. But also we know that the occupation has to end, that has to be everyone's vision for the future of Palestinians and Israelis enjoying their basic human rights and living in safety and dignity.
We've spoken about Israeli human rights. Do Palestinian human rights need to get better as well?
You mean the Palestinian Authority's treatment of its own population? Absolutely. And increasingly, the Palestinian Authority is an autocratic regime denying its own population basic rights. I mean, they are not free to criticize their own government, and you have very close security cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli military. So the same person can and does have their rights violated both by Israel and by Palestinian authorities as well. Torture in interrogations, crackdowns on journalists and on other critics. I mean, even for posting something critical on Facebook, Palestinian police can arrest you and interrogate you, and worse.
What's your website, Facebook page for people who'd like to know more?
It's Hamoked, HAMOKED.org.
Okay, Jessica, thank you much.
Thank you.